Hi guys, so in my last Etsy haul I did go into a tiny bit of detail about the Addams Family, and I did mention this book, which is The Addams Family, The Evilution. So I thought today I'd give you a quick sort of review and kind of go into some of the history behind the Addams Family and how the story has developed into what we know as the Addams Family today. So the Addams Family was originally created by an illustrator called Charles Addams. So Charles Addams was known for his one-panel cartoons, and they were normally sort of dark-humoured. So in 1937, these cartoons started to be published, which is when he first introduced the Addams Family into the public eye, as they were published as one-panel cartoons. So in 1964, Filmways Productions kind of got hold of the idea of the Addams Family and were given permission by Charles to create a 64-episode series of the Addams Family. So this series only went on for 3 years, and after that there were a few kind of cartoon-related things based around the Addams Family, but it wasn't until 1991 that the first Addams Family film came out, which is the one which is probably the most well known. And then you have in 1993 the Addams Family Values film came out. So originally Charles Addams's illustrations weren't of any specific family. It was an anonymous sort of set of people, and they were only later named the Addams Family after Charles Addams himself. So within this book it explains how originally Morticia was the only real character that was based around these sort of dark-humoured cartoons, and she was just living out her day-to-day life and other characters were slowly introduced. It was thought that Morticia was based on Charles's first wife because they did share quite a few physical similarities. However, it is known that Charles Addams did kind of like this dark persona and image of a woman, as all three of his wives did all have that similar appearance to them. So once these cartoon characters started to develop, Charles kind of took it upon him to name each of the characters. So he did begin with Morticia, and to name her he just looked through the yellow pages for inspiration, and he came upon the Mortician page, and that's where he got inspiration for the name Morticia. So as the popularity of these cartoons increased, Charles had to bring in other characters just to create more content, basically, which is when characters such as Gomez started to come in. So for many darkly inclined people, Morticia and Gomez are kind of seen as this perfect couple, as they are just depicted as really sort of in love with a lot of passion. But Charles never actually stated that they were married or even a couple. He just depicted them as very close, and they were kind of seen always sort of next to each other, which is where this sort of idea that they were a married couple came. So one thing I do really like this book about this book is it goes into a lot of detail about how Filmway Productions kind of adapted the illustrations into their TV series. So once Charles Addams had given permission to Filmways Productions to make the TV series, he gave them a short description of each of the characters to follow. Now in this book it does have sections for each of the characters. So this one is obviously for Morticia, and then this paragraph is just the small sort of description which Charles gave. Again, for Gomez it's another small paragraph, but it just goes into detail about sort of the character traits. So the reason that Charles Addams did these really small little character profiles was that he wanted to ensure that Filmway Productions did actually do his illustrations justice, and they kind of portrayed what he wanted to portray within his illustrations. Now he did realise that some adaptations would have to be made to make it into a TV series, and to make a full sort of long storyline, things would have to be added, which is why he made the actual descriptions and said, you know, as long as these descriptions are accounted for, other things can be added just to sort of piece everything together. So as I said earlier, Charles Addams didn't actually ever say that Gomez and Morticia were married or even a couple, which is something that was adapted within the TV series, because the idea of speaking French is a very big part of their relationship. So if anyone has watched the 1964 TV series of the Addams Family, you will know that whenever Morticia says anything in French, Gomez will drop what he's doing and come running to her and give her some affection, which is something that was used to show that they were actually a couple, other than like possibly brother and sister. I do personally think that this French thing was slightly overdone, but it did give it a comedic value to the actual TV series, which is something which Charles Addams did want to include because his illustrations were made for expressing his sort of dark sense of humour. So this idea of speaking French was carried down to the 1991 and the 1993 films of the Addams Family and the Addams Family values, especially through the iconic Caramia and Mon cher, which Gomez and Morticia sort of say to each other when they're sort of exchanging pet names as such. So there were other adaptations which were made to the story of the Addams Family just to make it flow better within film rather than cartoon. And another like sort of key thing which I have picked out from this book is the character Thing. So within the book, again, it has a small description of Thing, and if you look closely here, you will see that this is how Thing was originally illustrated within the cartoons. And as you can see, Thing actually has a face and a sort of upper body is shown within these illustrations. So within many of the illustrations of the Addams Family, especially within the house, Thing is shown as a creature who is looking over the banisters, observing the family's everyday of life. Now you will see Thing's upper body, you will see their arms and their head, but you will never see anything below his waist. So Charles Addams was very general about the description of Thing. He gave real information other than that it was a creature of good soul and good nature, which sort of takes away from the fact that it could kind of be like a predator or seen as sort of an evil within the household. So we know that it is Thing is a good part of the family, but he does mention that Thing is not staff. That is purely Lurch's kind of job, is to be the staff member, whereas Thing is more I guess could be seen as a pet within the family. So obviously there is a massive contrast between how Thing is illustrated in Charles Addams's cartoons and how Thing is portrayed in the 1991 and 1993 films, where Thing is just seen as a hand cut off at just the wrist. So this illustration is the main inspiration for how Thing became how we know as just a hand. And if you look closely here in this record player, you can see a hand helping changing the records over while the family are just going about their everyday business. So after seeing this particular illustration of Thing, Filmway's production kind of went with it and only depicted Thing as a hand coming out of a box. It never stated that Thing was cut off at the wrist or anything, but you did only see the hand, and it would always be within a box. Now there would be a box in each room or some kind of item which Thing could come out of, which meant that Thing could travel around the house and always interact with the family, but it was never depicted as a creature that was looking down and observing the family. Also from this illustration, because Thing was kind of being a helping hand as such, that is how Filmway's production kind of changed the character slightly to make Thing a member of staff within the house. Although obviously not as much as Lurch, but they still kind of call upon Thing whenever they do want something done or something like a message delivered. Now, with the development of technology, you can see how within the 1991-1993 film, it was possible to create a hand that could crawl around without having it stuck in a box, which is obviously very helpful. It means that it's a lot more flexible to work with, and it did mean that Thing could communicate through sign language and stuff with the family. So it did make, it did fill in some of the gaps and make it a lot smoother. However, I do feel it did kind of lose the original idea of what Charles Addams thought of as Thing, because it did lose the original idea of it being this whole creature, whereas now it is just a hand. unfortunately, it's not only Thing who lost sort of part of their identity within the whole idea of these adaptations developing, because other details were lost on the way, and I think Wednesday Addams is a great example of this. So what you will notice if you do look through any of Charles Addams's illustrations of the Addams Family, compared to the Filmways Productions TV series, the cartoons which were published between then. I know there was a Scooby-Doo one, and then with the most recent 1993 film, you'll see that Wednesday Addams grows up throughout the whole of the development of the family. Within the illustrations, Wednesday Addams is seen as a quite shy, quite timid girl. She's seen running to her parents sort of for guidance, whereas Pugsley is more of a boisterous child who is always sort of up to mischief. So a great example of this was shown in my Etsy haul, one of the stickers that I bought. I will insert a little clip now of the sticker. See, Wednesday is a lot more timid than she is depicted in more recent adaptations. Within more recent adaptations, she is kind of seen as quite feisty. She kind of holds her own. She doesn't really let anyone talk down at her. Now, although I do think this character development is somewhat a good sort of representation of how the family is developing, because obviously the children are going to grow up, but I do think that the producers did kind of miss out a few of the more childish sides of her, which brought a little bit more comedy and comedic sort of dark humour to Charles Addams' illustrations. So this is one of my favourite cartoons of Wednesday Addams, and it shows Gomez pushing her on a broomstick. Now this does kind of, although it's not really darkly humoured, I do really kind of like this idea, which I feel like this sort of parent-child bond was kind of lost within the more recent adaptations. And then moving on to this cartoon, again, this shows more parent-child relationship, but you do kind of miss out a few of the quirks, I think, within the more recent films. Now this bit at the bottom is talking about the piggy went to market, and he continues, and it just does apply that Wednesday does have an extra toe. Now a common fact which isn't actually mentioned in any of the recent adaptations of the Addams Family is that Wednesday has 6 toes on 1 foot, which, although this is a very small detail, I think that this is kind of a quirk to Wednesday which is missed and could potentially have brought slightly more humour, or slightly more things could have sort of referred to it within the films. So within this book, it does feature some of the more rough illustrations of Charles Addams, which weren't actually published within the New Yorker newspaper, which is a thing I do really love about this book, is that it does feature some never seen cartoons which are kind of more exclusive just to the family, but they were obviously kind enough to share them with the public within this book. So within a lot of these cartoons, it depicts Pugsley and sort of what he does sort of as a day-to-day sort of fun activities. And so you can see that it's on top of a house and it has this kind of netting with a slide. And when you look closely, you can see that he's moved the slide to an empty bit of netting. So obviously, once someone goes down the slide, they'll fall right off the top of the house. Now, Pugsley is shown as a very sort of boisterous prankster kind of character within all of the illustrations which he features within, but I do think this is possibly lost within the more recent adaptations. So I do think it is a shame that Pugsley has kind of taken a back seat within the more modern adaptations, because I do think that possibly out of the two siblings, he was the one with the most sort of dark character, which could have been played upon more within the recent films. But I do think there is potential for Pugsley to have his own show, because he is kind of shown as the instigator of many of these kind of cruel pranks within these illustrations. I do think that there is so much to be used within this. There's so much inspiration from these illustrations which could be used to create a whole kind of series about Pugsley. So this book is something which I do really recommend for any any sort of fan of the Addams Family or anyone who wants to find out some of the history behind this. Now, one of my favourite characters of the Addams Family is Cousin It, and I was quite surprised to find that Cousin It wasn't actually a massive contributor to any of these illustrations by Charles Addams. He was only featured in 2 illustrations, and both of them Cousin It was shown by himself. He wasn't actually interacting with the family, which is why within the book he is mentioned under family, friends and acquaintances. So this was the first ever cartoon of Cousin It, and as you can tell just on the mug it does just say IT for It, which just kind of subtly suggests that that is what this character is called. As you go on to, unfortunately, the last illustration that It features in, it just says at the bottom, this is It speaking, and it just shows kind of the back of a very hairy person speaking on the phone, which is kind of when it sort of relates to both of them, and the kind of viewer can make this interpretation that this character is called It. So this book does go into a little bit more detail about kind of the development of how he was fitted into the family. He was named Cousin It to give him a little bit more relation to the characters, and sort of bring him into the family more than just sort of being an outside character that kind of fitted in with the theme of the illustrations. So this book so I'm really happy with this book. I did get it off of eBay, because I do know when you buy them new they are relatively expensive, but I did see quite a few on eBay which were second hand. Now this one I just got off a seller who they were just given 2 of them on a birthday or Christmas or something. So this one was never used, it was never opened, so it's completely new, but they were selling it about half the normal retail price because they did just want to get rid of it. They already had one. Although there are so many illustrations which you can find sort of online of Charles Addams, as I did mention, there are some in here that were never really published within any newspapers, so they are quite exclusive to the book, and I do kind of recommend getting this book if you are a fan of the Addams Family or just want to know a little bit more about it, because there are so many like hilarious like cartoons within this which have kind of been missed and lost within the system, whereas this book, just everything's in there and everything's really nicely laid out, so you can just find the sort of section or character that you want to sort of read about. There's not too much writing either. There's probably, I guess overall there's probably about 20 pages worth of writing, and the rest is just cartoons, which I think is like a perfect balance between, because it will give you a little bit of information and then all the cartoons of which the characters sort of feature in. So as some of you may know, Tim Burton was actually set to do his own stock frame animation of the Addams Family, but unfortunately he did drop that idea a couple of years ago. So there is still kind of an empty space for a sort of more modern Addams Family, but I do think there is so much inspiration which could be gained through the illustrations by Charles Addams. So I do think there is definitely potential for a lot more of the Addams Family in the future. And as I did say, I do think that the character Pugsley could definitely be used to someone's advantage to create a kind of even a small sort of kids TV series. You could kind of relate it to sort of Dennis the Menace, or possibly like the more modern Horrid Henry. So I do think that there is definitely a gap in the market for that. So I'm looking forward to what the TV and film sort of companies can bring out, and I just hope that they will do Charles Addams's illustrations justice, and hopefully sort of link back to some of the finer details which have been lost throughout history. So thank you very much for watching. I'll put the name and all the details, like including the IBSN of this book, down below in the description if any of you are interested in checking it out. I would just like to mention quickly the Etsy store Bedlam Supply. They do quite a few sort of items which relate back to the illustrations of Charles Addams. You can get pocket mirrors, tins and stickers and button badges, so definitely check that store out. I will put a link down there in the description as well, because if you do like Charles Addams's illustrations then you will definitely love the products. So if you've enjoyed this kind of video, please leave me a like or a comment below. I am considering making this kind of thing into a series just because there are many interests of mine which I have found quite a lot of background history behind, which I personally think that it isn't really like a well-known thing out there. So I would like to share some of that information with you online, but again, please just leave a comment below. So thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.